The millionaire CEO had built his world on logic, control, and silence, until the day a letter arrived from the woman he hadn't seen in 6 years, revealing that she was gone, and had left behind 2 sons who were his. Edward Harper sat at the head of the long glass table in the conference room, nodding absently as another quarterly figure was projected onto the wall. His assistant slid a fresh stack of reports in front of him, but something unusual caught his eye. Nestled between spreadsheets and stock forecasts was a plain envelope, handwritten, unmarked except for his name. It was so out of place in this polished, digital world that he almost pushed it aside, assuming it had been misdelivered. But something about the handwriting made him pause. He stared at it longer than necessary, a strange unease curling in his chest. Then he knew. He recognized the writing. Hannah. He hadn't heard that name, hadn't said it out loud, in 6 years. Not since she disappeared from his life with no warning, no note, and no goodbye. He had tried to forget her, buried himself in mergers and luxury and order, told himself whatever they had wasn't real enough to miss. But his hand trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, as if his body had known better all along. Inside was a letter and an official-looking document from Child Protective Services. He pulled out the letter first and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was just as he remembered, looped, clear, intentional. The first line stole his breath. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone." His heart dropped into some place that didn't care how many billions he had earned. The room around him faded, the voices muffled, and all he could hear was the sound of his own pulse as he read on. She wrote that she had been sick. That she hadn't told anyone, especially not him, because she hadn't wanted pity or interference. That she knew he had moved on, or at least told himself he had. But she had kept a secret. A truth she couldn't die without trying to share. She had 2 sons. Twins. 5 years old. And they were his. Edward's vision blurred. His fingers tightened on the page. She wrote that if the letter had reached him, it meant she didn't survive, and the boys, Liam and Noah, were now in the care of the state. She begged him, not out of obligation or guilt, but because she had known once who he really was. She believed there was still a part of that man left. The official document beneath confirmed everything. Names, dates, location of the temporary care facility. A copy of her will. He didn't remember standing, but suddenly the chair was pushed back and someone in the room was calling his name. He didn't answer. He walked out of the meeting without explanation, the letter still clutched in his hand. His car was waiting downstairs, but for the first time, he didn't know where to go. He sat inside, staring straight ahead, the traffic outside a blur of meaningless motion. Hannah was gone. The woman he had once imagined building a life with had died without ever telling him the most important thing of all, that he was a father. And somewhere, 2 little boys with her eyes were waiting. He had missed 5 years. He had missed her last days. But he would not miss what came next. The drive to the Child Services office was a blur. Edward didn't remember how long he sat outside the building before going in. The sky was dull, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that came before a storm, but inside him, everything already felt like it had collapsed. The receptionist greeted him with a cautious smile when he gave his name, as if she knew exactly why he was there. She made a quick call, and within minutes, a woman named Karen met him in the waiting area. She introduced herself as the caseworker for Liam and Noah. She looked at him carefully, as though assessing whether she saw anything fatherly behind the expensive suit and guarded expression. Without much small talk, she gestured for him to follow her. They walked down a narrow hallway lined with faded posters about fostering and family reunification. Karen glanced over her shoulder and said, "The boys don't know who you are yet. We only tell children what we can confirm. So far, you were listed in the letter and the will, but nothing more." Edward nodded. He appreciated the professionalism but couldn't stop the growing sense of guilt pressing on his chest. She led him to a small room with a large observation window. Inside were 2 boys sitting on a rug, building something out of plastic bricks. They were identical, dark brown hair, pale skin, and large blue eyes that stopped Edward's breath. Hannah's eyes. They were both dressed neatly in hand-me-down clothes, clean but slightly too big. One of them spoke softly to the other, and they both laughed in unison. It was such a normal, gentle moment, and yet it felt monumental. "They're doing okay, considering," Karen said quietly. "It's only been 2 weeks since their mother's death. They were with her when it happened. Ambulance couldn't get there in time. She passed at home." Edward swallowed hard and looked away. He felt like an intruder standing on the outside of a world that should have been his. He should have known. He should have been there. "Can I meet them?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Karen nodded and opened the door. The boys looked up when he entered. For a moment, no one spoke. Edward crouched down, not too close, just enough to meet their eyes. "Hi," he said gently. "My name's Edward." One of the boys, he thought it was Liam, tilted his head slightly and blinked, then returned to stacking his blocks. The other one, Noah, watched him without saying a word. Edward stayed quiet, letting them get used to him. After a few minutes, Liam said, "Are you here to take us to a new house?" Edward hesitated, then replied carefully, "I'm here to get to know you. If that's okay." Liam shrugged. "We've had 3 people visit. One brought cupcakes." Edward smiled faintly. "I didn't bring cupcakes. But I could try next time." Noah finally spoke. "Do you know our mom?" The question landed like a weight. Edward looked straight at him and said softly, "Yes. A long time ago. She was very important to me." Noah nodded slowly. "She had a picture of you in a book. She never told us your name, but she said if anything happened, someone good would come." Edward couldn't speak. His throat tightened. He had come in expecting to feel like a stranger. But somehow, even in her absence, Hannah had given him a bridge into their lives. He stayed with them for nearly an hour, helping build towers and watching them argue and then laugh again. He didn't try to correct them or force anything. He just stayed. And when Karen told them it was time for dinner, Liam looked up and asked, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Edward nodded. "I will. If you want me to." Noah didn't speak, but he came over and quietly handed Edward a red brick from their building pile. Edward took it as more than a toy. It was the beginning of something fragile, something new. And this time, he wouldn't let it go. The next morning, Edward woke earlier than usual. Not because of meetings or alarms, but because his mind was already racing before the sun even rose. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't on contracts or negotiations. They were on 2 boys with blue eyes who had asked if he would come back. He stood in front of the mirror adjusting his tie, only to pull it off and toss it on the bed. It didn't feel right. Instead, he pulled on a sweater and jeans, clothes he hadn't worn in public in years. He looked more like a man than a title, and for once, that felt like the point. He stopped by a small cafe on the way to the center and asked the barista if they had cupcakes. They only had muffins, but they were warm and soft and came in pairs, so he bought 2. When he arrived at the facility, Karen was waiting in the lobby. She smiled slightly when she saw the paper bag in his hands and said, "They'll like that. They've been asking about you since breakfast." It struck him again how quickly children attach themselves to hope, and how terrifying that hope could be if left unmet. He followed her down the hallway, his chest tightening with a mixture of nerves and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. This time, the boys were in a different room, a small classroom with bookshelves and art supplies. They sat at a table coloring, and when they saw him, both froze for just a second before Liam broke into a shy grin. "You came back," he said, not as a question but as a confirmation of something he had dared to believe. Edward nodded and sat down across from them, placing the bag on the table. "I brought muffins," he said. "They're not cupcakes, but I think they're close." Noah reached forward first, taking one and peeling the wrapper with careful fingers. Liam waited, watching Edward as if measuring his presence. Then he took one, too. For the next hour, they colored together in silence and in chatter, depending on the minute. They asked him questions: where he lived, what his car looked like, if he knew how to make pancakes. He answered everything honestly. Then came the question he hadn't prepared for. Liam looked up and said, "Are you our dad?" Edward's breath caught. He had known it would come eventually, but not yet. He looked between them and said gently, "Yes. I think I am." Noah blinked, wide-eyed. "How come we didn't know?" Edward looked down at the drawing he was shading in and said, "Because I didn't know either. Not until a few days ago." They were quiet for a while, processing. He let them. He didn't push. Later, while the boys went to the playground, Karen pulled Edward aside. She said the temporary custody paperwork could be started if he was ready. The state would still evaluate him, check his home, and monitor the transition. He said yes before she could finish. He knew he wasn't ready in the way that word was usually used. He didn't have the answers, didn't know how to braid hair or fix bruises, didn't know bedtime routines or favorite songs. But he was ready to try, and that was something Hannah had believed he could do. That evening, he stood in the middle of his penthouse and realized how much it looked like a life designed for no one else but him. Everything was gray and clean and expensive, and yet none of it looked like home. He walked from room to room thinking about where twin beds might go, if there was enough space for a play area, whether the echo of silence in the halls would sound different with laughter in them. The next day, he bought a second-hand bookshelf, some art supplies, and a calendar with dinosaurs. He wasn't just preparing for a visit. He was preparing for a life. One he hadn't known he needed until two boys looked at him and asked if he'd return. The transition to temporary custody happened faster than Edward expected. Within a week, the paperwork had been filed, the interviews completed, and the home inspection approved with minimal comment. The caseworkers were surprised by how well prepared he was, but they didn't know that every free moment he had was now spent researching parenting blogs, visiting toy stores, and rereading Hannah's letter for clues about the boys' routines and preferences. He asked Karen if they had any comfort items, favorite blankets, toys, even old pajamas, but she told him the boys had arrived at the shelter with almost nothing. That fact haunted him more than he let show. When the day came to bring them home, he arrived early with two matching jackets folded in his hands. He found the boys in the same playroom as before, seated side by side building with blocks. Liam was the first to see him and ran toward him without hesitation, while Noah followed more slowly, holding a drawing that he refused to let go of. It showed three stick figures holding hands, and under it, in uneven handwriting, it said, "Us." Edward crouched down and opened his arms, uncertain if they'd accept the gesture, but both boys pressed into him like it was already the most natural thing in the world. The ride to his penthouse was filled with soft questions from the back seat. Liam asked what the building looked like and if it had a rooftop. Noah asked if there was a bathtub or just a shower. Edward answered every question patiently, trying to speak in the reassuring tone he had heard other parents use. When they finally pulled up to the sleek glass building in the heart of the city, he hesitated before helping them out of the car. Would this place, so cold and curated, ever feel like home to them? Inside the apartment, everything felt different than it had the day before. The hallway was still wide and the floors still polished, but now there were crayon drawings taped to the fridge, two small backpacks by the door, and a dinosaur nightlight glowing faintly in one corner of the living room. The boys wandered through the space slowly, touching things, asking what was allowed and what was just for show. Edward laughed more than once, realizing how little in his life had ever been touched by curious hands before. Later, he gave them a tour, pointing out their room, which now had matching beds with soft blankets, a stack of books on the nightstand, and twin nightlights they had picked out together. He showed them the kitchen and the bathroom and let them each choose which cabinet they wanted their things in. The first meltdown came just before dinner when Noah couldn't find the drawing he'd carried in. He panicked, tears spilling before Edward even understood what was happening. But instead of freezing or retreating like he once might have, Edward knelt beside him and helped look until they found it under the couch. He framed it that same night and hung it above their shared bed. After dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, both slightly burnt, Liam asked if they could watch a movie. Edward said yes and sat on the couch with them, one boy curled on each side. He didn't follow the film. He just sat there listening to their quiet laughter and felt something settle inside him. It wasn't peace exactly, or joy. It was responsibility. It was belonging. That night, after the boys had fallen asleep and the apartment had gone quiet, Edward stood outside their door and just listened. He thought about Hannah and what she must have gone through, getting sick, raising twins alone, writing that letter with no guarantee it would ever be read. He thought about the years he'd wasted thinking his life was full simply because it was scheduled. And now, here in the stillness of a room filled with small breaths and nightlight shadows, he realized how much more there was to feel. He didn't know what the next week would bring, or if he'd be good at any of this. But he knew he would try. Not to make up for lost time, that wasn't possible. But to honor it. To build something new in its place, day by day, story by story, bedtime by bedtime. The first full week with the boys was a blur of routines that didn't yet feel like routines. Edward quickly learned that mornings with children were nothing like the silent, solitary sunrises he was used to. There was cereal spilled across the counter, missing socks discovered only after shoes were on, and endless negotiation about what kind of toothpaste tasted less spicy. By the third day, he stopped wearing white shirts at breakfast and started keeping an extra pair of socks in the kitchen drawer, just in case. It was chaos, but it was their chaos now, and it slowly began to shape something that resembled a family. Liam was the early riser. He would always be up first, wandering sleepily into the kitchen asking for toast or to sit on Edward's lap while he sipped his coffee. Noah took longer. He would emerge only after he heard Liam talking or the sound of cartoons drifting from the living room. Edward respected their rhythms. He didn't rush them unless school demanded it, and even then, he tried to make the rush feel like an adventure. Some mornings they listened to music while brushing their teeth, and other days they made it a game to see who could get dressed fastest. Slowly, they started to smile more in the mornings. That felt like a win. The nights were harder. The boys still asked questions. About their mom. About what would happen next. One night, as Edward tucked them into their beds, Liam looked up and asked quietly if he would still be there in a year. Edward sat on the edge of the bed, unsure how to answer. Not because he doubted himself, but because he didn't want to say anything that sounded like a promise if it didn't feel absolutely true. He said, "I can't tell you what every year will look like. But I'm here now. And I want to stay. That's my choice." Liam didn't say anything. He just reached out and held Edward's hand until he fell asleep. That same night, Edward stayed awake long after the boys had gone to bed. He stood at the window looking out over the city, the skyline glowing beneath the clouds, and wondered how many other people out there had built their lives so high only to realize they had nothing solid beneath them. He thought of Hannah again, how strong she must have been to raise two boys alone and how much she must have feared for their future when her own became uncertain. He ached with the guilt of absence but tried not to let it drown out the gratitude of being here now. Throughout that week, Edward made time to read to them every night. He found books with dragons, astronauts, and magical trains, each one more exciting than the last. The boys started to argue over whose turn it was to sit closer to him, and eventually, they settled on the obvious solution, one boy on each side, leaning against him as he read in a voice that was getting better at sound effects. They laughed more. They hugged him without hesitation. And once, when Noah scraped his knee running through the hallway, he ran straight to Edward without a second thought. Edward didn't flinch. He scooped him up, cleaned the wound, and whispered, "You're okay. I've got you." It was a small moment, but the kind that echoed. The school called once to ask about emergency contacts, and Edward realized with a pang that there was no one else to list. No grandparents. No close friends. Just him. The boys had no backup plan. That made everything feel heavier, but also clearer. He didn't want them to ever feel like they were waiting to be taken away again. They needed roots. Not just shelter, but permanence. And slowly, day by day, Edward began to believe he could give them that. By the end of the week, the apartment looked different. The boys' drawings were now taped to more than just the fridge. Their laughter filled the empty hallways that had once echoed with silence. Their shoes were lined up at the front door beside his. And every night, when he turned off the light in their room and listened to their even breathing, he felt something unshakable settle in his chest. He was still afraid. But he wasn't running. He was staying. And they, somehow, were staying too. By the middle of the second week, the boys had started calling the apartment home without thinking about it. Edward noticed it first when Liam said, "Can we go home now, after school pickup," the way a child says something that feels ordinary to them but extraordinary to someone else. That word, home, meant something completely different now. It wasn't about square footage or high-rise views. It was about routine, presence, safety, and the growing comfort between them. Edward had started rearranging his life to make room not just physically but emotionally. His calendar, once color-coded and packed from morning to night, now had blank spaces labeled dinner, pickup, and bedtime story. His assistant didn't question it anymore. That week also brought its first parent-teacher meeting. It was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, and Edward had rehearsed what to say. But when he sat across from the kindergarten teacher and heard her describe the boys as kind, curious, and slightly shy, he found himself getting unexpectedly emotional. She said they were adjusting well and had already made a few friends. She also mentioned that Noah had told the class his dad picked him up now and made the best toast ever. Edward smiled, thanked her, and walked out of the school with a lump in his throat and the faint realization that he was already more than temporary in their lives. Back at home that evening, Noah brought him a drawing. It showed 3 figures again, Edward, Liam, and Noah, but this time there was a 4th figure in the sky, drawn with long hair and a heart on her chest. "That's Mommy," Noah explained. "She watches from the clouds. But you're the one here now." Edward knelt down and took the picture carefully, as if it were made of glass. He wanted to say something wise, but his voice caught, and all he could do was pull Noah into a quiet hug. Moments like these didn't ask for speeches. They asked for stillness. And love. One night that same week, Edward found a small box tucked in the back of the boys' closet while searching for extra socks. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Hannah holding the boys when they were babies, and the other of her and Edward, taken years ago, smiling on a beach. He hadn't even known she kept it. That evening, after the boys were asleep, he sat alone in the living room holding the photo, staring at the past and feeling the full weight of it. Not just the loss, but the second chance buried within it. He whispered her name, a thank you and an apology wrapped into a breath he didn't know he was holding. Friday brought a surprise. The boys wanted to cook dinner, pasta, their favorite. Edward was skeptical but agreed, and they spent almost an hour boiling water, over-grating cheese, and dropping noodles on the floor. It was a mess, but when they sat down at the table and said cheers with their juice boxes, he realized it was the best meal he'd had in years. Afterward, they curled up on the couch to watch a movie, and both boys fell asleep halfway through, their heads resting on his shoulders. He didn't move. He just sat there, the blue glow of the screen washing over them, a quiet contentment filling the room. Later that night, as he carried them one by one to bed, Edward caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. He looked tired. Softer, maybe. But more whole than he ever had. He was no longer living in fragments of what might have been. He was living something real. He placed the drawing Noah had made on his nightstand and turned out the light. Then he stood at the door for a while longer, just watching them breathe. It wasn't just that he loved them. It was that they loved him back, and trusted him enough to sleep deeply under his roof, with no doubt he'd still be there when they woke up. On Saturday morning, Edward woke up before the boys and found himself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of an apartment that no longer felt silent at all. Even in stillness, he could hear them, the quiet rustle of blankets from the next room, the memory of their laughter echoing from the day before, the trace of their little feet running across the hardwood floors. It was strange, the way they had already filled the space, not just physically, but emotionally. The once minimalist penthouse was now scattered with toy cars, books with bent covers, socks that never seemed to stay paired, and drawings of dragons and spaceships on nearly every wall. But what filled it most was the feeling of being needed, seen, chosen. When he entered the boys' room, Noah was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed with his stuffed animal tucked under his arm. He looked up and whispered, "I didn't hear you come in." Edward smiled and crouched beside him. "I didn't want to wake you." Liam stirred in his sleep and rolled toward them, mumbling something about pancakes. Edward laughed softly and said, "I think that's a request." They spent the next hour making breakfast together, badly. The pancakes were misshapen, and the syrup ended up in places syrup should never be, but they ate every bite, proud of the mess they'd made. Later that day, Edward took them to the park, the one with the large wooden ship in the middle of the playground that they had pointed out every time they passed it in the car. The boys ran ahead while he sat on a bench nearby, watching them climb and yell and call for him every time they reached the top. "Look, Dad!" Liam shouted, waving from the highest point. Edward's heart clenched at the word, still not used to hearing it out loud, but more and more grateful each time it came. He waved back and stood up, walking closer, pretending not to panic as Noah jumped from a platform and landed hard on the ground before standing up triumphantly. For the first time, Edward felt less like he was playing a role and more like he was simply living one. That evening, they returned home just as the sky turned pink with the setting sun. They all kicked off their shoes at the door and dropped their jackets in a heap. Dinner was quiet, tired from the day, and after they were bathed and in pajamas, Edward read them one of Hannah's favorite childhood books, the one with the lost star trying to find its way home. When the story ended, both boys asked him to stay a little longer. He lay between their beds on the rug, one hand resting on each mattress. They talked softly in the dark, and at one point, Liam said, "I think Mom would have liked it here." Edward didn't respond right away. His eyes stung, but he didn't let the tears fall. He said, "I think she would have loved it." When they finally fell asleep, he walked into the living room and poured himself a glass of water, standing in front of the large window overlooking the city. The skyline looked the same, but everything in his world had changed. His phone buzzed, emails, missed calls, but he didn't check them. Instead, he picked up the framed photo of Hannah and the boys as babies. He looked at her smile and whispered, "I'm doing my best." There was a peace in knowing she had believed in him, even when he hadn't deserved it. And there was power in trying to live up to that belief every single day. Before going to bed, he walked one more time down the hallway and opened the boys' door just enough to see their shapes curled beneath their blankets. They looked so small, so safe. And for the first time since they had come into his life, he didn't feel like he was holding his breath. He felt grounded, steady. He knew there would be challenges ahead, questions he couldn't answer, fears he couldn't erase, but tonight, all that mattered was that he had stayed. And they had let him. The day of the final custody hearing arrived with a weight that Edward felt deep in his chest from the moment he woke up. He hadn't told the boys much about what was happening, only that it was an important meeting and that he needed to make sure everything was set so they could officially stay together forever. They didn't ask for details, but Liam had quietly slipped his favorite dinosaur sticker into Edward's suit pocket before they left the apartment, and Noah had asked if he'd be home in time to help with their science project. It wasn't fear that Edward carried with him that morning, it was the fragile hope of making something permanent out of something he never expected to have. At the courthouse, the halls were quiet, lined with beige walls and worn-out floors, and the sound of every footstep echoed a little too loud. Karen met him at the entrance of the courtroom, holding a folder filled with documents, but her smile was soft and steady. She told him the judge had reviewed everything and that barring any unexpected developments, things would move quickly. He thanked her, but his hands still trembled slightly as he smoothed the front of his jacket and took a deep breath. The room was plain, lined with wooden benches and a single table near the front. When the judge entered, Edward stood with a straight back, every part of him trying to reflect the truth of who he'd become, not just the man he'd been. The judge asked questions about the boys' routines, their school, their health, their behavior. Edward answered everything honestly. He didn't pretend he had figured it all out. He spoke about burnt pancakes and bedtime books and missing socks. He talked about how Liam liked to sing quietly when he didn't think anyone could hear and how Noah had started collecting stones from every place they visited. He mentioned the frame drawing above their beds and how every night when he turned off the lights, they said goodnight to their mom before whispering goodnight to him. And then the judge paused and looked directly at Edward and asked, "Are you ready to be their father?" For a moment, the room was completely silent. Edward's throat tightened, but his voice didn't waver. He said, "I already am. I wasn't there at the beginning, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I will be here as long as they'll have me. This isn't about filling a space their mother left behind. It's about building something new that honors what she gave them, and gives them a future they can trust." The judge nodded slowly and smiled, not formally, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had heard not just an answer, but a truth. With a few final words and a signed order, it was done. The custody was permanent. The boys were his. On the way home, Edward stopped at a small bakery and bought the biggest chocolate cake they had, the kind with bright icing and colorful sprinkles, and he had them write, "Welcome Home," across the top in blue. When he walked into the apartment, the boys were on the floor surrounded by crayons and construction paper. Liam jumped up first and asked, "Is it done?" and Edward knelt down and opened his arms. Both boys ran to him, and he hugged them so tightly it felt like the final piece of something broken finally fit back into place. He whispered, "You're mine. And I'm yours. Always." That night, they had cake for dinner and stayed up past bedtime watching movies. Edward didn't care about the mess or the clock. He cared that both boys fell asleep tangled beside him on the couch, warm and safe and full of sugar and certainty. As he carried them one by one to bed, he looked around the apartment, no longer seeing it as a space filled with expensive things, but as a home filled with stories, memories, and a kind of love he had never known was possible. Before going to sleep, he pulled out the photo of Hannah one more time and placed it beside the framed drawing on the nightstand. He didn't speak this time. He just looked at her and hoped she would know, wherever she was, that he had heard her. That he had shown up. That the family she once built alone was now being carried forward with hands that finally understood what it meant to hold something fragile and never let it go.